I need to tell you about the 2 years my mother-in-law spent trying to prove, in a court of law, that my daughter wasn't really her granddaughter. I still have the court transcripts. I still remember the exact words my daughter overheard through a cracked door, words she wasn't ever supposed to hear. And I remember, more than anything, the moment everything Margaret believed about real family collapsed under the weight of her own hidden history. My name is Claire. I'm a pediatric nurse, which means I've spent my career comforting children through some of the worst moments of their lives: broken bones, diagnoses no parent wants to hear, the aftermath of accidents that change a family overnight. I've learned how to stay calm when everything in me wants to fall apart. That skill, more than any legal strategy my attorney ever built, is what got my family through this. My husband James and I adopted our daughter Lily as an infant, after 4 years of infertility treatments that took more out of both of us than either of us liked to admit out loud. I remember the day we finalized the adoption more clearly than I remember our wedding. James's father, Robert, cried in the courtroom, unashamed, holding Lily like she was made of glass. Margaret sent a card. She didn't come. I told myself at the time that grief takes strange shapes in people, and that Margaret's absence that day was just her own complicated way of processing something. I gave her the benefit of the doubt for a long time after that. Looking back, I think that benefit of the doubt cost my daughter more than I ever wanted to admit. Over the next decade, the signs were small enough that I could always explain them away individually. Margaret introduced Lily to new acquaintances as James's adopted daughter, a phrase she never used for any other family member's child. At Thanksgiving, she'd occasionally mention blood relatives when discussing family traits or resemblances, always in passing, always deniable if you called her on it. Once, at Lily's 8th birthday party, she commented to a neighbor that it was sweet how much Lily had picked up James's mannerisms, as if that were a surprising accomplishment for a child who'd been raised by him since she was 3 weeks old. There was a particular Christmas, when Lily was around 6, that I've gone back to in my memory more than once since all of this started. Margaret was handing out gifts to the grandchildren, and when she got to Lily's cousin, a biological grandchild on James's brother's side, she said warmly, "This one's from your real grandmother," meaning herself, distinguishing herself from some other relative entirely unrelated to the conversation. It was a strange, almost nonsensical thing to say in context, and I remember catching James's eye across the room, both of us silently agreeing to let it go rather than make a scene during the holidays. I wonder now how many of those moments simply evaporated, because neither of us wanted to be the one who made Christmas dinner uncomfortable. I mentioned it to James once or twice over the years. He'd sigh and say, "That's just how Mom talks. She doesn't mean anything by it." And because I loved him, and because I didn't want to be the wife constantly picking fights with her mother-in-law over comments that could always be interpreted charitably, I let most of it go. James and I never sat down and compared notes on all of it together. If we had, I think we would have seen the pattern years before we finally did. The real turning point started with something that had nothing to do with Lily at all. Robert had a stroke 3 years ago, mild but serious enough that it forced our whole family to finally sit down and talk about things nobody likes discussing: wills, trusts, what happens if the worst happens again. James's parents had an existing family trust, drafted decades earlier, and during that first difficult conversation about updating it, the attorney read aloud the language naming beneficiaries: James's children, full stop, no qualifiers, no distinctions. I remember watching Margaret's face when those words were read. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Something in her expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the way a person's face changes when they've just heard something they intend to quietly deal with later on their own terms. I found out what dealing with it meant about 4 months later, and not from Margaret herself. James's cousin mentioned it to him, almost as an aside during a phone call. The way people mention things they don't realize are significant. "Your mom's been asking me a lot of questions about adoption and inheritance law lately," she said. "Is everything okay?" James called his father directly that same night. Robert's answers were vague, evasive in a way that wasn't like him at all. "Your mother has some concerns," was all he'd say. "She's talking to someone about it. I think you should ask her yourself." James confronted her 2 days later. "I wasn't in the room, but he told me every detail afterward, his voice shaking with an anger I'd genuinely never heard from him in 15 years of marriage. Margaret didn't deny anything. She said, calmly, like she was discussing property lines rather than her own granddaughter's place in the family's assets should stay with family blood, James. That's not a controversial position. I've always believed that. She's your granddaughter, James said. She's a wonderful girl, Margaret said. That's not the same thing. You held her the day we brought her home, James said, his voice breaking on the memory. You said you'd never seen anything so perfect. And I meant it, Margaret said. That doesn't change what I'm asking the court to clarify. James told me later that this was the moment something in him finally shifted permanently. He'd spent 38 years finding ways to excuse his mother's comments, to translate her coldness into something more forgivable. Standing in her kitchen that afternoon, hearing her separate wonderful girl from real family in the same breath, he said he finally understood that there was no translation left to offer. She meant exactly what she said, and she'd apparently meant it for years. 3 weeks later, we received formal legal notice. Margaret had filed a petition with the court, seeking a declaration that the trust language, James's children, should be interpreted to exclude non-biological grandchildren from the beneficiary class. In plain terms, she was asking a judge to formally rule that Lily didn't count. I want to be honest about the moment I read that petition. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. Something in me went very cold and very still, the same feeling I get in the pediatric ward when a situation suddenly requires absolute focus instead of emotion. I remember thinking, clearly, this woman picked the wrong mother to do this to. We hired an attorney named Patricia Hale, a sharp, unshakable woman who specializes in family and estate law, and who I think had genuinely seen every version of family cruelty imaginable over her career. In our first meeting, she told us something that steadied me more than anything else could have at that point. Legally, she said, adopted children have full legal equivalence to biological children for inheritance purposes in virtually every U.S. jurisdiction. Your mother-in-law's petition is, frankly, weak. But I want you to understand something important. Winning this case legally and protecting your daughter's heart through this process are two completely different battles. The law can fix the money. It can't undo what she might hear along the way. I remember asking Patricia, somewhat desperately, whether we could simply make this go away quietly, offer some kind of settlement, anything to keep it out of a courtroom and away from Lily entirely. Patricia shook her head gently. People like your mother-in-law don't file petitions like this because they're looking for a settlement, she said. She's not doing this for money. She's doing this to make a point. And point-making campaigns like this one don't usually end quietly, no matter how much either side might want them to. She was right, of course, though I didn't fully understand how right until months later. I didn't fully understand what Patricia meant by that until the night Lily overheard her grandmother say the words that changed everything for our family. It happened during a tense holiday dinner, one of those gatherings where everyone's being carefully, deliberately polite in a way that feels worse than open conflict. Lily was supposed to be upstairs, finishing homework. She came down quietly for a glass of water and stopped just outside the dining room doorway, out of sight, when she heard her grandmother's voice through the crack in the door. She's not really ours, Margaret said to Robert, her voice low but not low enough. And everyone knows it, whether they say it out loud or not. I didn't hear it happen. I found out later from Lily herself, curled up in her bed that night, refusing to look at me directly. Am I really part of the family? She asked me. So quietly I almost didn't hear it over the sound of her own breathing. I sat on the edge of her bed for a long time before I trusted myself to answer without my voice cracking. You are the realest part of this family there has ever been, I told her. Being someone's daughter was never about how you got here. It was always about everything that happened after. She didn't fully believe me that night. I could tell. She turned toward the wall and asked, in a smaller voice than I'd heard from her in years, then why did she say it like that? Like it was something everyone already agreed on. I didn't have a perfect answer for that. I told her the truth as gently as I could, that some people carry old fears that make them say cruel things they haven't fully examined themselves, and that none of that had anything to do with whether it was true. I don't know how much of that landed with an 11-year-old at 10 o'clock at night. But I stayed until her breathing slowed and she finally drifted off, one hand still gripping the edge of her blanket the way she used to as a toddler when she couldn't sleep. I promised myself, sitting there in the dark with her, that I was going to make absolutely certain she never had a single reason to doubt it again. I didn't confront Margaret directly after that. I wanted to. Every part of me wanted to drive to her house and say things I'd have regretted the moment they left my mouth. But I'm not built that way, not when it comes to protecting a child. I channeled everything into the case instead, working with Patricia to make sure this fight ended not just in a legal win, but in something so thorough that Margaret would never have room to argue the point again, publicly or privately. As part of standard legal discovery, Patricia requested extensive family history documentation from Margaret's side, routine paperwork in cases like this, meant to establish the family history behind the original trust language. Margaret resisted these requests with an intensity that struck all of us as strange. She hired a second attorney just to fight the scope of the document request, dragging out simple procedural motions for weeks over what should have been a straightforward paperwork exchange, arguing at one point that decades-old family records were irrelevant and unduly burdensome to produce, an objection Patricia later told us she'd rarely seen raised over documents that old and that seemingly harmless. In 20 years of practice, Patricia said during one of our case update calls, I've seen people fight discovery requests because they're hiding financial fraud, infidelity, sometimes criminal history. I have genuinely never seen someone burn this much in legal fees, fighting over their own grandparents' paperwork. There's something here she doesn't want found, and whatever it is, it's clearly worth more to her, emotionally, than the money she's spending to keep it buried. Why would routine documentation make her this defensive? I asked James one night, both of us lying awake long after we should have been asleep. He didn't have an answer, but his father did, in a roundabout way a few weeks later. Robert had been unusually quiet through most of the legal proceedings, present at family gatherings but withdrawn, watching Margaret's crusade unfold with an expression I couldn't quite place at the time. One evening, when James stopped by to help him with some yard work, Robert said something that stopped James cold. There are things about your mother's family you don't know, Robert said, not looking up from the hedge he was trimming. Things I've kept quiet about for a long time, for her sake. James pressed him gently, the way you'd approach a skittish animal, but Robert shook his head. Not yet, he said. Not until I know I have to. James told me about that conversation the moment he got home, both of us sitting at our kitchen table turning the words over, trying to guess at what his father might be sitting on. We ran through a dozen possibilities that night. An old affair, some hidden debt, a falling out with a relative none of us had ever heard of. Neither of us came anywhere close to guessing the truth. I don't think either of us could have. It wasn't the kind of secret you'd expect to find hiding behind someone who had spent 2 years insisting so forcefully on the importance of real blood family. I think back now on how strange it must have been for Robert, watching his wife build an entire legal argument around a principle that directly contradicted his own understanding of who she truly was underneath it all. I don't know if his silence in those months was cowardice, loyalty, or some tangled combination of both. I've come to believe it was probably all three, in proportions even he couldn't have untangled. The first hearing took place about 5 months after Margaret filed her petition. I sat in that courtroom and watched my mother-in-law testify with a composure that genuinely unsettled me. Cold, certain, completely convinced of her own righteousness. She spoke about family bloodlines and the intent of the original trust, like she was discussing case law rather than a child she'd watched grow up for 11 years. At one point, Margaret's attorney asked her directly whether she loved her granddaughter. Of course I do, Margaret said without hesitation, in the same even tone she might have used to confirm an address. Love and legal inheritance are two entirely separate questions. I remember gripping James's hand hard enough that my knuckles went white, watching him absorb his mother reducing his daughter to a legal technicality in open court. Patricia's response was methodical and devastating in its own quiet way. She walked the court through decades of established case law affirming adopted children's full legal equivalence to biological children for inheritance purposes, citing statute after statute in a flat, unhurried voice that somehow made the rebuttal land harder than shouting ever could have. Then she produced something even more damning. The original trust drafter's contemporaneous notes from decades earlier, explicitly documenting that Robert and Margaret had intended the language James's children to include any children James might have, by birth or by adoption, a phrase written in the attorney's own handwriting in the original file. Your Honor, Patricia said, holding up the yellowed original document, the petitioner is asking this court to override the explicit, contemporaneously documented intent of her own late estate planning, based on a personal belief that contradicts the very words her own family's attorney wrote down decades before this dispute ever existed. I watched Margaret's composure crack, just slightly, for the first time since this whole nightmare began. Her jaw tightened, her hands, folded neatly on the table in front of her, curled just slightly tighter around each other. It was during the discovery process, buried in the documentation her own resistance had somehow made take longer to fully compile, that Patricia's team found something none of us expected. Not a document about Lily, a document about Margaret. An adoption record dated 1958, naming an infant girl who would grow up to become Margaret herself. I remember the exact moment James read that document out loud in Patricia's office, his voice going flat with disbelief. My mother was adopted, he said, like he was testing whether the words made any more sense out loud than they had on the page. My mother has spent 2 years in court arguing that adoption doesn't count as real family, and she was adopted herself. Patricia sat quietly for a moment, letting the weight of it settle before she spoke. This changes the entire legal posture of the case, she said carefully. Not because her personal history is automatically relevant, but because her stated legal theory, that biology defines legitimate family membership, is directly contradicted by the facts of her own life. If we introduce this, it doesn't just weaken her argument. It collapses the foundation underneath it. None of us said anything for a long moment. I think we were all doing the same math in our heads, trying to understand how a woman could build an entire legal crusade around excluding someone from blood family, while having spent her entire life as living proof that the distinction she was fighting for didn't actually determine who a family was. James called his father again that night, and this time, Robert didn't deflect. I've known since before we were married, Robert admitted, his voice heavy with the guilt he'd clearly been carrying for decades. Margaret's parents told her when she was a teenager, and it devastated her. She spent her whole life terrified that people would find out and see her as somehow less legitimate, less real. Her own adoptive mother used to remind her, when she misbehaved as a girl, that she was lucky to have been chosen at all, like it was a debt she owed rather than a family she belonged to. I think that's where all of this really started, if I'm honest. I promised her I'd never tell anyone. I thought I was protecting her. He paused for a long time. I think I just let her spend her whole life running from something that never should have shamed her in the first place, and now it's cost your daughter something I don't know how to fix. I sat with that for a long time after James told me. It didn't excuse anything Margaret had done. It didn't make the words Lily overheard hurt any less. But it did make a horrible kind of sense out of a cruelty that had never quite added up before. Margaret hadn't been defending some deeply held family value. She'd been running from her own deepest fear her entire life. And somewhere along the way, she decided the only way to manage that fear was to draw the hardest possible line between real and not real family, and stand firmly on the side she'd always been terrified she didn't actually belong to. The second hearing took place 6 weeks later, and by then, the adoption record had become part of the official court file, not as some incidental piece of gossip, but because it directly undermined the entire legal theory Margaret's petition was built on. If blood wasn't what made her legitimate as a member of her own family, Patricia argued, then Margaret's claim that blood should determine Lily's legitimacy collapsed under its own logic. Margaret's attorney tried to withdraw the petition quietly before the hearing even started, clearly hoping to avoid the record becoming public in any formal proceeding. I understand in a strange way why they tried, but the judge denied the request, and I remember the courtroom going completely silent as she read her ruling aloud, the kind of silence that feels heavier than any noise could. This petition doesn't get to simply disappear, the judge said, looking directly at Margaret over the top of her glasses. It's dismissed with prejudice on the record for the reasons stated by opposing counsel. She paused, and I watched her decide, deliberately, to say the next part out loud rather than leave it unspoken. I'll also note, for the record, the particular irony of a petition arguing that adoption negates family legitimacy, filed by a petitioner who was herself adopted as an infant. This court sees no legal, moral, or logical basis for the distinction the petitioner has attempted to draw, and frankly, petitioner's own history illustrates precisely why that distinction has never held up to scrutiny. I have never in my life seen a person's face fall apart the way Margaret's did in that moment. Not from anger, from exposure. 68 years of carefully maintained certainty collapsing in a courtroom, on the record, in front of her own son. James didn't reach for her. Robert did, quietly, taking her hand as she sat rigid in her chair, and for a moment I saw, underneath everything, two very old people confronting a truth neither of them had ever wanted spoken aloud in front of witnesses. I thought that would be the end of it, at least for a while. I was wrong, though in a way that surprised me. About a month after the ruling, Margaret called and asked, hesitantly, if she could see Lily. Alone, if I would allow it. I said no to that specifically. Alone wasn't something I was willing to offer, not after everything, but I agreed to a supervised visit at our house, with me in the next room, door open. I watched from the kitchen as Margaret sat across from my daughter at our dining table, looking smaller somehow than she had in any courtroom. She didn't launch into some polished apology. If anything, it came out clumsy, halting, nothing like the composed woman who testified about bloodlines with such total conviction months earlier. I was wrong, Margaret said, about a lot of things. I understand now, better than I ever wanted to, what it feels like to be told you don't really belong somewhere. She stopped, swallowed hard. I should have told you a long time ago that you belong here, more than anyone. I'm sorry it took me this long, and I'm sorry about how you had to find out I understood that at all. Lily listened, quiet and guarded, the way an 11-year-old listens to an adult who has hurt her badly enough that she's not ready to simply hand over forgiveness, because it was finally offered. She didn't say much back. At one point she asked, carefully, "Were you scared when you found out you were adopted?" Margaret nodded, and for a moment the practiced composure she'd carried through 2 years of legal proceedings simply fell away entirely. Terrified, she admitted. I thought it meant something was wrong with me. I spent most of my life trying to prove I was as legitimate as everyone else around me. And I think, somewhere along the way, I decided the easiest way to do that was to make sure no one could ever say the same thing about me that I was afraid people were quietly saying anyway. I'm ashamed of how long it took me to see what that cost you. I watched my daughter sit up a little straighter in her chair, and I understood that this wasn't healing exactly, not yet, but it was something. A door left open instead of slammed shut. The trust itself was formally confirmed without amendment a few weeks later, Lily's inheritance rights secured exactly as they always should have been, exactly as they always legally were. There was no dramatic gavel, no triumphant courtroom moment for that final piece. Just paperwork, filed and finalized, the quiet, unglamorous ending to something that had taken over 2 years of our lives. James's relationship with his mother has settled into something careful since then, not fully repaired, not fully severed either. He calls her occasionally. He brings Lily to see her only with me present, and only for short visits, though those visits have grown slightly less guarded over time. I don't know if that will ever fully change, and I've made peace with the possibility that it might not. Some things, once said out loud in front of a child, leave a mark that time softens but doesn't fully erase. I think about this whole ordeal now, and what strikes me most isn't the legal victory, even though I'm relieved by it every single day. It's the conversation I had with Lily the night after her grandmother's visit, when she finally asked me the question I'd been waiting 2 years for her to ask out loud. "Do you think Grandma Margaret really believes I'm part of the family now?" she asked. "I think she's finally starting to understand what it actually means to belong somewhere," I told her. "But here's the thing, sweetheart. It was never up to her to decide that in the first place. It never was. You belonged in this family the moment we brought you home, and no petition, no court case, no comment through a cracked door was ever going to change that fact. It just took your grandmother a very long time and a very hard lesson about her own life to finally understand something you never needed to be taught at all. Lily thought about that for a while, tracing a pattern on her blanket with one finger the way she does when she's working something out in her head. I think I believe you, she finally said. Most days, anyway. I told her most days was enough for now. I meant it. Healing rarely arrives all at once, in one tidy conversation, no matter how much we might wish it did. Not for an 11-year-old, and honestly, not for the rest of us either. What mattered was that she was asking the question at all out loud, to someone she trusted to answer it honestly, instead of carrying it silently the way she had that first devastating night. James and I talk sometimes about what we'll tell Lily when she's older, about the fuller context of everything that happened. Margaret's own adoption, Robert's decades of silence, the particular cruelty of someone projecting her deepest fear onto the one person who least deserved to carry it. For now, she has the version that matters most, that she belongs unconditionally and that the people who are supposed to love her without qualification eventually did, even if one of them took an entire courtroom, a judge's public rebuke, and 68 years of buried history to finally get there. Margaret spent almost her entire life terrified that someone would discover she wasn't real family, carrying that fear so heavily that she eventually turned it outward, aiming it at an 11-year-old girl who'd done nothing but exist and be loved. And in trying to prove my daughter didn't belong, she finally had to face the one truth she'd spent 68 years running from, that the thing she feared most about herself had never actually disqualified her from anything, and neither had it ever disqualified Lily. Family was never about the paperwork that brought you into it. It was always about who stayed, who fought, and who refused to let go, even when the truth got complicated enough to test every single one of us.